Today I'm going to talk about this paper is written by Cowen at Stanford University. This paper is one of the few papers that I found that discussed how contextual are contextualized with representations. In recent years, the idea of contextualized with representation has become really popular. In 2018, at NACO, Alan and I proposed ELMO, which used a combination of word representations from different layers of LSTMs. And they use this representation to outperform various state-of-the-art in the benchmarks. The difference between contextualized word representations between the traditional word representations is that in a traditional one, a word is corresponding to each vector. No matter which sentence the word is in, you represent the word with one fixed length vector. Whereas in the contextualized word representation, you encode a sentence. Let's say, you have a sentence of n words, and then you encode them with something like BERT or ELMO or GPT-2 to get n word vectors. What's different from this, from the traditional embedding, is that in contextualized word representations, in each sentence, all of the words are considered when you're computing the vectors at each locations. Of course, in the unidirectional contextualized word representations like GPT-2, you only consider the words before the current word. But in this case, the context of this word occurring is considered. This is what enables the language models to capture the conditional usage of the words instead of only the original usage. This is beneficial because the meaning of word as we perceive are largely conditioned on the situation that you are hearing, or in other words, the context. Let's say, for example, the word apple. If you just say apple, it can mean different things. It can be the fruit, it can be the company, it can be a lot of other things. But if you put this word apple into some context, like an apple that keeps the doctor away, then nobody is going to consider the apple here to be the name of a company. Depending on the context, the meaning of a word can be interpreted into different meanings. This is contextualization. How contextualized are the question is, how does the language models, to what extent does the language models offer the contextualization? Do the language models just do that so that they only slightly change the vectors at some dimensions, or do they largely change the vectorization so that a word is very different across different contexts? And also, ELMO has 3 layers. BERT and GPT-2 usually has 12 layers. There are also variants that contain 24, 36, or even 48 layers. There are many different layers of representations. In which layers are the words the most contextualized? These are basically the questions that the author wants to address in this paper. To address these questions, the author used several metrics. They proposed three metrics. Self-similarity, intra-sentence similarity, and maximum explainable variance. I'm going to talk about them one by one. Self-similarity is the average of the cosine similarity of the meaning of the words, each word occurring in different contexts. Let's say if a word occurs in n sentence, where let's say S1 all the way to Sn, in each sentence, the word under the context of sentence n is represented with the contextualized word representations f of s, ssn, word at location I. This is word I. And the author adds another subscript to denote the else layer of the language model. You take the average cosine similarity of these pairs, and also these two and this, to get n times n minus 1 pairs of the cosine similarities. So you take the average of these cosine similarity pairs to get the self-similarity metric. If a word has a large self-similarity, then it means intuitively that the representation of that word is very similar across different contexts. We need to adjust for an isotropy, of course, but we will talk about that later. The second metric is intra-sentence similarity. This considers a sentence S. Let's say you have several words in the sentence, and each word is represented with a vector that is computed from all of this sentence, or all of these words in a sentence. Let's say this is word 1, word 2, word 3, and you take the average of this word into a sentence representation, which is Fs. The author defines intra-sim by computing the cosine similarity between the sentence vector and each of the word vector. So if the words are very close to each other, then there's going to be very high intra-sentence similarity. If the words point to different locations, then it's expected that you have relatively lower cosine similarity between those vectors. The third measure is the maximum explainable variance. A word is, as I mentioned before, a word can be represented differently in different contexts. So in contextualized word representations, if a word occurs in M context, each one contains D dimensional vector, then the representation of this word, essentially you can stack these vectors into a M by D matrix. Whereas in the non-contextualized word representations, regardless of how many contexts this word occurs in, the word is represented with 1 by D matrix. So the author in this paper wants to reduce the matrix in the large matrix into a more simple matrix. So he wants to ask, to what extent can the information be preserved if you do this reduction? There is a theoretical upper bound, which is the variance of the first principal component divided by the total variance. This is basically the maximum explainable variance. It means that when you reduce the large contextualized matrix into a small dimensional vector, how much information or variance can you preserve? Okay, as I mentioned before, these three measures should be controlled for anisotropy. Why do we need to control for isotropy? Because let's first talk about what does isotropy mean. The concept of isotropy actually comes from chemistry, where the molecules are pointing to the same direction in an object. If the molecules are pointing to the same direction, it's isotropic. Then, on the other hand, it's anisotropic. The author uses the notion of isotropic here in language models to represent the effect that whether the words from this language model is pointing to the same direction. Let's say if this vector is apple at context 1, this is apple and context 2, and this is pear at some context, then you can see the word vectors are pointing into different directions, and this is anisotropic in general. So how does the concept of isotropy is related to the three measures that we mentioned before? It's like this. If you measure the self-similarity, for example, the extent that the word apple in context 1 differ from the word in context of sentence 2, This cosine similarity itself does not tell too much things, because you don't know how much does the other words are different. So we need to compare it against an isotropic baseline. For self-similarity, the baseline is the average cosine similarity between the representations of uniformly random sample words from different contexts. So if you know that although Apple 1 and Apple 2 has 0.95 self-similarity, let's see if, this is definitely not 0.995. These two have 0.95, but the baseline is 0.3 for random words. Then this means that in different contexts, the word apple occur in really similar locations in the distributional space. Let's say on the other hand, if there's 0.99 for random words, then you know that in these two contexts, the language model actually differs them by so much that 0.95 is way lower than the average of random words. In similar way, there is a baseline for intrasim and MEV as well. The baseline for intrasim is that the baseline for intrasim is also the intrasim for random words. The baseline for intrasim is the intrasim between sentence constructed. The baseline for intrasim is the intrasim of sentences constructed from random words. And the baseline for MEV is the proportion of variance in random words. These are basically how the author analyzes the contextualization of contextual language models. Let's see what the authors found. For anisotropy, they found that contextualized representations are anisotropic in its all non-input layers. There's a geometric interpretation of anisotropy. The word representations occupy a narrow cone in the vector space rather than being uniform in all directions. The greater the anisotropy, the narrower this cone is. Contextualized representations are generally more anisotropic in higher layers. This is sort of intuitive because if you go higher up in the layers, you do more post-level processing and you retain less the information contained in the word rather than the context. So the representations are more anisotropic. For example, let's see the word representation in GPT-2 last layer. They are so anisotropic that any two words have on average an almost perfect cosine similarity. This pattern holds true for BERT and ELMO as well, although there are some exceptions. In terms of context specificity, contextualized word representations are more context specific in higher layers. Stop words have among the most context-specific representations. Context specificity manifests very differently between language models. In ELMO, words in the same sentence are more similar to one another in upper layers. In BERT, words in the same sentence are more dissimilar to one another in upper layers. And in GPT-2, word representations in the same sentence are no more similar to each other than randomly sampled words. This figure sort of illustrates this trend. In addition, the author discusses some connections between the contextualized word representations. So on average, less than 5% of the variance in a word contextualized representation can be explained by a static embedding. Also, the principal components of contextualized representations in lower layers outperform GloVac and FastText on many benchmarks. Why not upper layers? I think this is because as you add in more contextualized informations, you discard some of the original meanings of those words, which are important when you reduce them to static word embeddings. Following the line of thought in this article, the author recommends making the language models more isotropic so that when reducing back to static embeddings, the word vectors will have nicer distributions.